So we're going to start, we were finishing up the Hilkhot, Tsitsit, and the Rambam. So last week we did Pereq Sheni. Now we're going to do Pereq Shlishi, and then we're going to move, when we finish Pereq Shlishi, which either, if we finish it tonight, if we have extra time, we can start the Shulchan Aruch. Otherwise we will hold on to the Shulchan Aruch for next time. But this is a great overview of all the halachot that puts us in the right, in a good place to understand and appreciate what the Shulchan Aruch is speaking about. So if we were to divide the first two Perakim, if we were to classify them and categorize them, we would say that the first Pereq really dealt mainly with the making of Tsitsit, what they're made out of, and how they are attached, and how they're knotted, and so on, and what they're made out of. The second Pereq dealt with Techelet primarily, and the issues of Techelet, and the interplay between Techelet and the white strings, how the Techelet is made, and how we verify that it's legitimate Techelet, and so on and so forth. And then we have Pereq Shlishi, which is going to deal with, for lack of a better word, if the first two dealt with kind of the substance of Tsitsit, this deals more with the obligation of Tsitsit, the actual mitzvah, because up till now we haven't actually encountered any mitzvah of Tsitsit. We've just described what are Tsitsit, what are the white strings, what is the blue string, what is it made of, how do you put them together, what if they get cut, and so on and so forth. Now we're going to get to the actual mitzvah. So, Pereq Shlishi, Kesut shechayav adam la'asot b'tzitzit min haTorah. So the Rambam says that what kind of garment is obligated in Tsitsit min haTorah biblically? He kesut sheyesh la arba kenafayim or yeter l'arba. So it has to have four corners or more than four corners, because we know it says al arba kanfot kesutcha. It says in the Torah that it has to be, the Tzitzit have to be placed on the four corners of your garments. ותחיה מידתה כדי שיתכסה בה ראשו ורובו של הקטן המהלך לבדו בשוק ואינו צריך אחר לשומרו וללך עמו. And it has to be large enough. מידתה means the midah, the measurement has to be large enough that the head and the majority of the body of a child could be covered by it. What kind of child are we talking about? A child who can walk by himself in the marketplace and doesn't need anybody else to walk with him and to guard him. So it's interesting because probably that's very socially dependent. I would say in the old days, maybe you would let a 7-year-old kid walk in the marketplace probably by himself. Nowadays, people are a lot more cautious and wary, and they're not going to let children under, 13, 14 walk around in the shuk by themselves, because they're going to be afraid of possible harm coming to them. But I would say that this is probably describing around a 7 or 8 year old, something of, in that range. So a talit, basically the garment size has to be such that a child could wrap their head and the majority of their body in it. That's considered large enough, because it has to be asher techaseba, something that you can cover yourself with. So you can't just wear like a small vest or a little cape. It has to be something that actually can cover a significant surface.
75% of the body, right?
It has to be to count as a talit. In other words, once it doesn't go by the individual. So let's say you take the talit of Nady. Okay, let's say Nady has a talit, and Nady's talit is large enough that it fits his head and the majority of his body. So you can say a bracha on that talit, even though it doesn't fit your head and the majority of your body, because it's a talit. In other words, once it qualifies for tzitzit, the mitzvah is tzitzit. So it doesn't go by the individual. Like if you have a giant, he doesn't have to have a giant talit. He won't be able to cover his head with the talit the same way that regular person would, and that's why everybody gets a tzitzit or a talit that fits their measurements. If you're taller, you get a taller one. If you're shorter, you get a shorter one. But really, to say the beracha, even a small talit, as long as the talit would fit a child, you could say a beracha on the talit. It just might not fit you well.
You mentioned that
it doesn't have to fit you personally. Yeah.
You just mentioned as an idea the whole thing about we wouldn't permit this particular criterion would be different now, but the poskim don't.
But the poskim don't hold that. I'm just saying that now that we have to think about what they were envisioning. They were envisioning a 7 or 8 year old. They weren't envisioning what we would consider safe, because now we're overcautious. I mean, when I was a child, and I'm sure that most of us, if not all of us, remember a time where your parents would let you go out when you were like 6 or 7 years old, and they didn't even watch you.
Yeah.
So nowadays people are, ever since the 80s, or when all those high-profile kidnapping cases happened, that parents started getting really worried about letting their children be left unattended. But when I was young, I was 6 years old, and I would go down the block, my parents couldn't even see me if they tried. and they didn't care. I would go with a group of kids. So that was what it was like. So now he says as follows. So v'tihya kesut shel tzemer or shel pishtim bilvad. So he gives us 3 criteria. One criterion is it has to have 4 corners. That's expressly in the Torah. Criterion number 2 is it has to be large enough that a child could do ituf, basically. A child could wrap his head and the majority of his body in it. And number 3, it has to be either made of wool or made of linen. And we're going to see, he's going to explain that the reason for this last halakha is a little bit different than the other 2. The first 2 halachot are particular to Tsitsit. That Tsitsit has to be a 4-cornered garment. That's right in the Torah. That it has to be a asher techaseh ba. It has to be something that you cover yourself with. So we say the minimum is the size of a child. But the fact that it has to be made of wool or linen, we're going to see what the basis for that is in a minute. Okay?
So when we get to Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah...
There's a machloket in the Gemara. There's a machloket in Masechet Menachot about this issue. It's also mentioned in Masechet Shabbat as well. It's mentioned in more than one place in Shas. That there's a machloket about whether Tzitzit min HaTorah applies only to wool and linen or it applies to all garments equally. So the Rambam follows the opinion that it's wool and linen is the only deoraita, and the Shulchan Aruch also does.
But it's the
Rama brings the other view but we'll see that when we get to Shulchan Aruch. Yeah. So aval talit shel shara minin. But if you have a talit made, let's say, of cotton. Okay, so for instance, kegon bigdei meshi, silk, bigdei tzemer gefen is cotton, or bigdei tzemer gemalim, you take camel hair and you make a camel hair talit. With tzemer arnavim, you take a rabbit's hair talit that might be very nice and soft, I guess, or you take the hair of a goat, which is actually coarser than you would probably want, and anything like this. In other words, any other material besides wool and linen, this is only rabbinically obligated in tzitzit. This is why we try to get a talit that's made of wool, because that way we're fulfilling the mitzvah min haTorah. If you do a cotton talit, many, like for example, if you get a talit katan, the cheap ones, they're made of cotton, or they're made of some kind of a synthetic material that
that is already a problem because it's not
right. It's not even natural, right?
Unless it's like 55%.
I think that's what they do. They make it the majority some natural material. I believe that's what they do. Yeah. So he says. Why did they make it? Why did they create this rabbinical? If the rule is only on wool and linen garments, why did they make it for all garments? So that people would be careful about the mitzvah of tzitzit, because if you knew that you could wear a garment that was 4-cornered and it didn't have tzitzit on it, and the reason is because it's made of a different material, you're just going to end up taking the mitzvah lightly. So this way it's a blanket mitzvah, but really the biblical mitzvah is limited. It only applies to wool and linen. It has to be square, at least 4 corners, if not more. And it has to be the minimum amount. In other words, so what is he saying? He's saying like this, that they never made you might say, okay, there are 3 criteria, right? Criterion number 1 is that it has to be 4 corners. Criterion number 2 was the size. Criterion number 3 was the material. Correct? So now he's saying, so the rabbis came along and said, even though the only materials biblically obligated in tzitzit are wool and linen, we're going to extend it to all materials, even cotton if it's a 4-cornered garment. But they didn't say, let's also make a rabbinical rule that if you have a 3-cornered garment, you need tzitzit. They didn't make a rule that if you have such a small garment that a child couldn't fit in it, in other words, that it wouldn't cover the head and the majority of the body of a child, that should also be obligated in tzitzit. In other words, they only extended the category of materials to include all materials. But those things which are qualitative in the mitzvah, in other words, the fact that it's something that can cover a child is qualitative. It's asher techaseh ba. The definition of kesut is lechasot, to cover. It has to be something which, if you take a napkin, and a square napkin, that's not a talit, obviously. If you and they didn't eliminate the fact that it has to be 4 corners because that's qualitative. That's part of the quality of the mitzvah, that it has to be on a four-cornered garment. It has to be 4 tzitziot on a four-cornered garment, and there are reasons for that. So they didn't mess with that and say, well, no, even if it only has 3, we're going to make a rabbinic rule that you have to have on all garments tzitzit, even 2-cornered garments. They didn't make anything like that.
Has to be kasut yom. And
that's true. That's going to come later.
There's also interesting nafkamina in the idea of but if the halakha is like here, like the Araisa is only from Pishtan December, then there's an Indian of kavod abriot. Like you have in a shuk, you fall down, your Tsitsit kapam puzzle.
Right.
So if it's kavod abriot, then it's only durabanan, let's say katna, then you can leave it on because it's very.
So you get home, right?
If it's not, if it's the Araisa cotton, then you have a problem. You have to in front of the shuk and everywhere take it off because you're doing it.
Right, because you're being mevatel mitzvah to say. That's an interesting question because there it's not a lo ta'aseh, it's an aseh. You're actually a bitul aseh. But yeah, they bring that also with regard to shatnez and things like that. The issues of dirabanan, right? Yeah. So
in theory, I had this.
I believe the Shulchan Aruch brings up that case. Yeah.
No, I had because when I started getting religious, I started putting on talit. My talit is semer, and I had pants that were linen. And I remember, and I just mentioned it once, and they were like, "Okay, well, you better take it off before nightfall, right? Because the obligation, because it's an aseh min Torah during the daytime." And therefore any shatnez problem. But as soon as night falls, then it's not necessary. You're not necessarily.
Right. We're going to get to that. So hold on to that thought. Hold on to that. So now what does he say? Shekol begadim ha'amurim b'Torah stam enam ela tzemer ufishtim bilvad. What's the reason? Why is the issue of the material from which the talit is made? Why is that different than the other two things? Because anytime it mentions begadim in the Torah, beged is referring to wool or linen. Anytime it says garment, it's referring to wool or linen. So when it talks about, let's say, for example, in laws of purity and impurity in the Torah, and it mentions beged, it's talking about wool or linen. So it's a universal principle. It's not just a principle of tzitzit. Like the four-cornered garment, that's unique to tzitzit, that it has to be a four-cornered garment. The size, that's unique to tzitzit. But in other words, if you're looking at the laws of purity and impurity, there are also laws related to garments. What size of garment is mikabel tum'ah? What size of garment could be subject to impurity? Questions like that. Okay, that's not. It doesn't say it has to be the size that a child could wear it. It's not gonna say that there. Because that's something specific to tzitzit. It's not going to say it has to be a four-cornered garment to be able to be subject to impurity, because that's not relevant to impurity. That's only relevant to tzitzit. But the idea that wool and linen are the only things called beged isn't something intrinsic to tzitzit. In other words, we could conceive of tzitzit on any kind of a beged, as long as it's four-cornered and it's something that's capable of covering a body. It's just that the Torah, whenever it says beged, means wool and linen. So that's why the rabbis came along and said, you know what, we should expand the category to all begadim. If there was a rule specific to tzitzit, that they're not going to change. But since it's not something intrinsic to tzitzit, it's actually a more general issue that the Torah, when it says beged, is only referring to wool and linen. It's not particular to tzitzit. And that's why there's nothing objectionable to the idea of putting tzitzit on a four-cornered cotton garment. It's just not required. But if you were to put tzitzit on a three-cornered garment, that would already be against the whole concept of the mitzvah, because the whole concept of the mitzvah is a four-cornered garment. Okay, so in other words, the fact that it's only wool and linen is not something that emerges, you could say, from the laws of tzitzit, where there's something about tzitzit itself that it has to be on a four-corner, that it has to be on a wool or linen garment. It's something more general. It's that the Torah in general only addresses begadim that are made of wool and linen. That's the distinction between the two. That's the distinction between the two. In other words, one of them is like we're talking about in logic class versus the genus versus the species. In other words, it's emerging from a higher category.
Right.
Because it's emerging from a higher category, it's not specific to tzitzit. And that's why tzitzit could be on a cotton garment.
But what's the source for the idea that begadim only refers?
They learned it from limud. They learned that from certain pesukim where it specifies tzemer upishtim.
Okay.
So they say, it's teaching you a general rule that it's only tzemer upishtim, it's only wool and linen. So that would mean to say that general rule, though, isn't a rule of tzitzit. If there were a principle of tzitzit itself, that we can't mess with, because then by changing it, you're changing the whole law of tzitzit. But because this law is a law that's extraneous to tzitzit, It's only because the Torah in general only addresses these two types of garments. That's why it's flexible. Okay, and that's why we can extend it to others. So al arba kanfot kesutcha halakha gima. He says that 4 corners. So arba velo ba'alat shalosh. That means not a 3-cornered garment. So if you have like one of those kerchiefs, that wouldn't be good. That wouldn't be the right size anyway. Im ken arba velo ba'alat chamesh. If that's the case, how do we know that what about a 5-cornered garment? Okay, you have a 5-cornered garment. You could say, okay, it's not 4 corners. So Talmud Omar Asher Techaseba. It gives you a general rule. Anything you cover with. Afilu Balat Chamesh or Yater Alzeh, even if it's 5 or 6 or 10 corners. Velama ani mechayev Balat Chamesh or Poter Balat Shalosh. Why is it that in other words, if we're not taking Arba literally, we're not taking the number 4 literally, so why is it that when it comes to 3 we say it's no good, but when it comes to 5 we say it is good? I mean, either it has to be 4 or it doesn't have to be 4. So what's the answer? Ushtehen enan balei arba kenafot. In other words, if neither v'lama ani mechayev balat chamesh u'poter balat shalosh ushtehen enan balei arba kenafot. So what's the difference? So the answer is mipnei sheyesh bechlal chamesh arba. Because if you have a 5-cornered garment, it's 4 plus 1. You have 4. You just have an extra. That's different than having shalosh. You have only 3. You're missing something. If you have too much is okay. Too little is not okay. So therefore, it says lefichach. Therefore, kishu said tzitzit lebalat chamesh or shesh. What makes you think? You have a 5-cornered garment. You took your talit, and it's got 4 corners, and you took one of the corners and you cut it into 5 to make it 2 out of the 1. So you have 5 corners. So what would you think? You might think, if the Torah requires me to put on tzitzit on a 5-cornered garment, now I have to put 5 tzitziot on here because it's 5 corners. If I have 6 corners, I need 6 tzitziot hanging because it's 6. So that's why he says lefichach. Therefore, because what's the only reason why we require a 5-cornered garment to have tzitzit? What's the only reason why? Not because a 5-cornered garment is actually obligated in tzitzit, but because because it has 4. The 4 that it has are required. The 5th one is extraneous.
You could have 100 corners.
Right. It's that what it's telling you is that 5th one doesn't take away from the obligation, but it's still only 4. So therefore, kishu oseh tzitzit lebalat chamesh or shesh eno oseh ela l'arba kinafayim hamiruchakot zo mizo me'otana chamesh or shesh bilvad shene'emar al arba kanfot kesutcha. Even when you're putting on a 5-cornered garment, you only put 4 tzitziot. Because you're still only looking at it as a 4-cornered garment. It's just got extra. So that's okay. Extra is good.
We learned last week if you take a kosher talit to 4 corners and you cut it, you have a problem because menasui you cannot just add the tzitzis to one of those 2 corners because you have. That was when you add it to a garment that isn't 4 corners yet. It's the other way. In other words, if you have a 3-cornered, and then you put the tzitzit, and then you cut to make it a 4-corner, in other words, it was round on the edge, and it was only 3 square corners, and the 4th one wasn't cut. So it was round. My kosher talit, and I can add it just one.
Adding you can do. You just can't. Adding you can do. You just can't put on the tzitzit and then make the 4th corner.
Right. Something done before it was you were chiyuv for it.
But if it has already 4 corners and you add 10 more, that's not going to take away from the 4. Right. But they have to be the 4 that are the most distant from one another, not ones that are close. So wherever the 5th one is, you have to figure out what the spacing is, and to space it out as evenly as possible across the talit.
I'm sorry. What reason we must see 4 corners?
What?
What's the reason?
What's the reason why there's 4 corners? There's a different. The Torah says this before. There are different interpretations of why. Some people say because it's supposed to represent the arba kanfot haaretz, the 4 corners of the earth. The idea that that Hashem is wherever we go, where our awareness of Hashem is everywhere. There's a lot of different interpretations of the 4. There are some who connect it to Yetziat Mitzrayim and Geulah, the redemption from Egypt, and the four language of Geulah, just like the Arba Kosot. There are a lot of different interpretations of why.
Is this why they're supposed to be in the 4 corners of your body?
No, the Shulchan Aruch is going to tell us this.
Okay.
Hold on to that. Okay? So, but it could be. It could be.
Okay.
But just hold on to it. All right. So now, So now the question is like this. We know that it says in the Torah to put the tzitzit al kanfei vigdehem, on the corners of your garments. And we just said that what is corner? I'm sorry, what is a garment? Wool or linen. Correct? So what happens? And the only things that are included, other than wool and linen, leather is not included. Only other hair, soft, like cotton and hair of other animals is included. But not not skin, not leather. So the fans, he doesn't need to eat, he doesn't need to. All right? So what happens if your beged is made of, in other words, if the garment itself is made out of fabric, but the corners are made of leather. You have some interesting talit. It has corners of leather. So where are you going to be hanging the tzitziot actually? On the leather, because the leather is the corners. But the garment is actually, the majority of the garment is made of, let's say, cotton or wool. So in that case, chayevet, you would have to put tzitzit. He shel or. If the garment is made of leather, uchnafesh lebeget turab. And you said to yourself, you know what? I want to be really cool. In 70s terms, at least, and I want to have a leather talit, but leather is no good for talit. So what am I going to do? I know what I'll do. I'll take 4 corners of beged. I'll take 4 wool corners. I'll put 4 wool corners. I'm like, it's going to be a leather talit. You like this idea? It's like I don't know, the motorcycle guys. Those like you like that. The motorcycle. He is. The motorcycle guys. Like those guys. They like everything leather. So they take a leather talit and then they just put on the corners 4 pieces of wool. So that should be good, but it isn't. Because when we talk about, even though you might think, oh, where does the tzitzit go? It goes in the corners. So what should I look at? The corners. But really it qualifies not the corners, but the garment. So therefore we have to go by the essence of the garment. So if you wanted to be really cool, you could have corners that were made out of leather. But you can't have a garment made out of leather. Because if the whole beged, in other words, if the kesut itself, the talit itself is made out of leather, it's already exempt. Even if the corners were made out of wool, it would still be exempt. Because even though you're affixing the tzitziot to the corner, it's kanfe vigdehem. What is it a corner of? It's a corner of the garment. Ultimately, the garment is that which is being qualified by the tzitzit, not the corners. The corners are just where you affix it. So the fact that where you're affixing it happens to be made of leather, we don't care about that, as long as the garment is made of wool. And if your talit was made of leather, the fact that where you're putting it is on a place that there's wool isn't going to make it a good talit. Because the actual talit is not made of one of the fabrics that's good. It's made out of leather instead. And even though you might be very cool and you might hang with the Harley Davidson guys or whatever, it's not going to be a good talit. Alright? So you wouldn't fulfill the mitzvah. So, yeah.
It's velvet. It's not that.
Oh, it's not. When was leather? I thought. When was the pan?
It was never. It was always.
Velvet was leather was always cool. I don't know. I remember the fans was in the 70s. I remember the fans. Yeah.
But that's not cotton. That's like synthetic.
What? Velvet. Yeah. Velvet is. Yeah. So kesut sheleshnei shutafin. If you share a talit. You couldn't afford a talit, so you went into business. You went in partnership. You bought a talit together with somebody else. You share the talit. So that's chayevet, because 2 people own it. It doesn't make it any less of a talit. Shnei emar, as it says, al kanfei vigdehem, because it says put al kanfei vigdehem in the plural. There could be a talit owned by 25 people. It doesn't matter. However, it says lo nemar kisutecha ela lema'et she'ula. However, the only reason why it says kisutecha, it has to be your garment, is because the one that you wear can't be borrowed from somebody else. If you own it, but you own it together with 20 other people, that's okay. You don't have to have complete ownership, but you have to own it. She'ula is exempt. She'atalita she'ula petura min hatzitzit shiloshim yom mikan ve'la chayevet. Because the first 30 days that you have a talit she'ula, that you have a borrowed talit, you don't have to put on tzitzit. Only after 30 days, if you borrow a garment for more than 30 days, now you have to put on tzitzit. So, because it's not yours. And after 30 days, midirabanan, the rabbi said you're already wearing it, in a way that is kavua. It's like yours. It's similar to living somewhere. You have to put in a mezuzah after 30 days. If you don't own the place, after 30 days you have to put on a mezuzah because you've made it your place by living there. So too with the talit. it wasn't yours initially, it was borrowed, but it's become yours because you're already wearing it for 30 days. Now
in the middle of the shuk, if it becomes possible, I can just makniz it and let someone else.
Yeah, you could do that.
It says, here, this is yours. And,
yeah, you could do. Yeah, exactly. You could do that. Well, the big question comes up with what about a talit in the synagogue? That's a halakha question or let's say somebody goes up let's say you have an unmarried Ashkenazi guy who doesn't wear a talit, and he's going up for an aliyah. So he wants to put it on a talit, or he's opening the Petichat Haichal. He's doing some honor. So the issue is, if I hand him my talit, he can't say a bracha. It's not his talit; it's my talit. So for him,
what does he care if he says a bracha?
Because it's patur.
Yeah,
no, I'm saying he can't. So or let's say a person comes to synagogue, and they want to take a talit out of here, and say the blessing on it. It's a problem. It's talit she'ulah. So for that person who borrowed the talit, it's actually exempt from Tsitsit. So interestingly, the poskim say, if you're a member of the synagogue, right? If you're a member of the synagogue, you own the talit. You don't own a lot of the talit. If you take your percentage of what you pay towards the membership, and you look at all those talitot, maybe you own one thread in the talit. But really, it's shutafin. It's shel shutafin. We all own the talit. It doesn't belong to. There's no such thing as a corporate entity that owns the talit. We all own it as a community. We own the talit. Every individual has a small piece of the talit. So therefore, if you're a member of the synagogue, you should be able to use it. If you're not a member, so then it's a question. Do we, because you come, you take the talit, and it's shi'ulah. So you shouldn't say a bracha, because it doesn't belong to you. If you're a member, now what if you didn't pay your dues? Okay, it's another issue. But I don't know, that's technical. But it's an issue with saying a blessing on talit shi'ulah. So, and I've seen people make this mistake. One time a guy came. He said, I really wanted to, I didn't put on a talit today. He just grabbed my talit. He said a bracha and put it on. I said, you can't really do that. Because even if I let you use my talit, you can't say the bracha. It's talit she'ulah. So, but it happened once. People don't always think straight. They get in the heat of the moment. Okay, so now, kesut shel tzemer. So now we get to, we know that there are two different types of garments, each of which is obligated in Tsitsit min HaTorah. You have a wool garment. So it's no problem. Obviously, you make the strings tzemer. You make them out of wool, the strings. If you have a linen talit, obviously, make the strings linen. Mimina, from the same type. Ushar begadim osin lavan shelechol min vamin mimino. Kegon chute meshi, lechsut meshi, chute notza, lechsut notza. V'imrata lasot lavan shel shar minim mitzemer or mipishtim oseh. So he says that generally, what's the procedure? When it comes to wool or linen garments, wool should go on wool and linen should go on linen. When it comes to any other garment, let's say you have a cotton talit, which is obligated rabbinically in the mitzvah of tzitzit, you should preferably use cotton tzitzit. You have a silk talit, silk tzitzit. Okay, you have one made of goat's hair tzitzit. It should match the garment. And this fits in with what we saw in the beginning of Pereq Aleph. That the Rambam said, what is the tzitziot supposed to be? It's supposed to be an extension it's an anaf, it's a branch, it's an extension from the garment itself. So it should match it in color, the Rambam said. If you have a white talit, it should be white. If you have a yellow, it should be yellow. If the green, it should be green. And it should match it in material. He says, however, if you used wool or linen tzitzit in any other garment, it's also good. Because wool and linen are kind of like the objective standard. They're like the gold standard, the objective standard. A beged of wool, a garment of linen are the objective standard. Strings of wool, strings of linen, they're the gold standard. It's like using they're the universal. Because they have objective significance as tzitziot. So you could put them on anything. Cotton strings are only good for cotton. Silk, it's only good for silk. Notza shalizim, the hair of the goats, is only good for hair of goats. But wool and linen are the universal. They're like having O-type blood. You can give to anyone.
So would the cotton talit with the wool?
That would be fine. Cotton talit with wool tzitzit is fine. Wool talit with cotton is no good. Because if you're dealing with wool, it must be wool.
Okay.
But the minhag is not to do with Pishtan today.
Yeah, that's true. He's going to mention that. Right. Yeah. That's correct.
Really
So ve'im ratzah lasot lavan
that's good for
mipnei shatzemer va'pishtim potrin ben b'minan ben shelo b'minan. because really wool and linen are putrin b'minan ben shelo b'minan. It doesn't matter if, in other words, if you have wool or linen strings, they can satisfy the obligation of tzitzit for their own type and for other types. Okay, they can be affixed to a wool tzitzit could be affixed to wool. A wool tzitzit could actually be affixed to linen, but we're going to see that we don't do that, even though it could be. It would be okay. The problem is a shatnez problem, a separate problem. We're going to see in a moment. Okay, but when it comes to the other types, since the other types, the whole construct is only rabbinical, so what they said was, okay, for cotton is fine. But you can't now think that I can take cotton tzitzit and put it on some other type of talit. The way that they set it up was, within its own type, cotton is recognized. Okay? Cotton is not recognized for wool. Cotton is not even recognized for silk. Each type for itself can be consistent, and you can have a garment of silk with silk tzitzit, a garment of cotton with cotton tzitzit, but you can't take cotton tzitzit and put them on a wool garment. That won't work. Wool and linen, on the other hand, can work for everything because they are objectively min Torah recognized. Now we get to umau lasot chutei tzemer bechusut shel kishtan. Or chutei, yeah.
What the reason put the talit on it for shachari, but not put the afternoon for mincha mari?
There's nothing wrong with mincha putting talit. There's just most people don't, but there's no reason why not. Really, just not the custom. There's nothing wrong with putting on talit. Like on fast days we do, you know.
Why putting the...
Actually, the Rambam says anytime you're doing tefillah, you should put on tzitzit. But it's just not commonly done. You're right. It should be just as good in mincha. Arved, it's nighttime, so there's no mitzvah tzitzit. But you're right. There's nothing really wrong with wearing a talit at mincha. We just tend to not. I think some Yemenites actually do.
Ashkenazim people do it.
No, only the Chazan. Only the Chazan. Yeah. So since we're saying that wool and linen are the universal donors of tzitzit, so wool tzitzit are considered tzitzit even if they're on a cotton garment, a silk garment, it doesn't matter. It's not relative to the garments, in other words. It's objective, as opposed to cotton tzitzit, which are only good tzitzit for cotton. It's all relative. But so why can't I take wool tzitzit and put it on linen? Why can't I take linen tzitzit and put it on wool? Obvious reason is shatnez. You're not allowed to mix wool and linen into one garment. And if you're going to knot this wool strings onto the linen, or vice versa, you're going to be violating shatnez. He says, "Afal pishu lavan levado below techelet." In other words, he says that even though it's only the white strings without techelet, but dinu sheyeh mutar. Really, in theory, it would be fine. So why does he mention that? Because let's say you were to have a linen talit and you had techelet. So techelet has to be wool. It must be wool. No matter what garment it is. It's a cotton garment, it's a silk garment, it's a linen garment. Techelet must be wool. So when it comes to, when you have a linen garment and you're using techelet, you would have to use wool anyway. You would have to have shatnez anyway. So it wouldn't even be an issue. But let's say today, where we don't have techelet, so therefore you have an option not to use any wool with this linen garment. So he says, "Shashatnez mutar linyan tzitzit." Really, in theory, even without techelet, you would be allowed to put a wool batch of tzitzit on your linen garment. Why? Because really, sharei techelet tzemerhi umatilin otah lepishtan. Because shatnez had to be, the Torah had to permit shatnez for tzitzit, since a wool string has to be affixed to make techelet. So the Torah permitted shatnez when you're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzit. So he said, why don't we do it today? מפני שאפשר לעשות הלבן שלה ממינה, בכל מקום שאתה מוצא עשה ולא תעשה, אם יכול אתה לקיים את שניהם, הרי מוטב, ואם לאו, יבוא עשה וידחה את לא תעשה. וכאן אפשר לקיים את שניהם. He says, nowadays we don't have techelet. So therefore, what do? So when it comes to linen, you can fully fulfill the mitzvah without any wool. Because you don't need the wool string. In other words, in the times when you needed the wool string because you had to have techelet, you had no choice. So you were allowed to put the techelet on with wool anyway, so you might as well put the other strings wool too. It doesn't make it any worse. But nowadays that we don't need the wool string, it's possible. Whenever it's efshar lekayem, whenever you're capable of fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzit without violating shatnez, it's much better. Just like anything else. If you have a positive mitzvah that pushes off a negative mitzvah for whatever reason, if you're capable of doing the positive mitzvah without pushing off the negative mitzvah, that's even better.
What about the thing about nighttime?
That's next. You're always getting ahead of me, you know? Okay, hold on.
So can you have three?
That's the next one.
Can you have three of pishtan and one of wool? If it's a techelet?
That's what you would have if you had techelet. That's what you would have.
No, you could have 4 of a wool.
Yeah, you could have even 4.
But I'm saying, can you?
Yeah, you could even do that. You would even be able to do
You could
it.
mix it up. I want.
It wouldn't make a difference.
I want 2 of my tzitzit to be pishtan, 2 to be.
Apparently, you could. It doesn't say it has to be of 1.
As long as it's all the gold standard, it's all good.
That seems that way. So he says, Kesut shel pishtan. If you have a talit of pishtan of linen, ein matilen bat techelet. Now this is rabbinical. Even when they had techelet, they didn't put it in. Why? They would make it only to have linen strings in the garment, and only the white. They did not put the techelet, even when they had techelet. Don't think it's because tzitzit is pushed off because of shatnez. That's not the reason. Actually, tzitzit would push off shatnez. It would. The only thing is, the only problem is that when is the mitzvah of tzitzit? During the daytime. So what's going to happen? You're wearing your beautiful linen talit that you got at Lord and Taylor, and you put in linen talit, beautiful techelet, together with your linen strings. 3 linens, let's say it's 3 linen strings and the 1 wool string. Oh, by the way, it would have to be that you could mix and match, because if the wool, there always has to be at least 1 wool string. Right, so you would have to mix and match, yeah.
The techelet has to be.
It has to be wool, so you're always going to be mixing and matching, yeah. Yeah, for sure,
Why
for sure.
does the techelet have to be wool?
Because that's just one of the rules. It has to be, yeah. So it's part of the definition of techelet that it's a wool string dyed blue. So if you had that. So you have the linen talit that you got, the beautiful talit. You're wearing it. It's got the blue string. So you're during the day, no problem. So your friend comes and says, "Hey, there's a wool string of blue in your linen garment." You say, "No problem," because mitzvat aseh of tzitzit is docha. The mitzvat lo ta'aseh. It pushes off the mitzvah of shatnez. No problem. But the only thing is, you're hanging out with your friends. You come to mincha. You're wearing your beautiful talit still, and all of a sudden the sun goes down. And it's arvit, and you're talking with your friends. And then you realize, hey, wait a second, the mitzvah tzitzit is over. Now what am I doing? I'm just wearing shatnez. I'm not doing a mitzvah anymore. When the mitzvah was working during the day, because I was wearing a talit, it pushes off shatnez. But now that the mitzvah is over, because it's nighttime, what's my excuse for wearing the wool and linen mixed together? None. So since a person doesn't usually think about that, am I thinking about the talit katan I'm wearing right now under my shirt? I'm not thinking about it. So if it were shatnez, would I have remembered to take it off in the middle of the day? Probably not.
Even if the
when exactly do you do it is another problem. But the ikar problem is that you're going to forget and you're going to be wearing it for sure. You're going to be wearing it. You're not going to remember. So
it'll be 3 stars.
Yeah. So you're going to forget. So that's the problem. So he says. So he says in other words, it's true that we should allow you to wear the wool string of blue with the chutei pishtan, with the linen strings on the linen garment, because you want to fulfill the mitzvah of techelet. And the mitzvah overrides, the mitzvah of tzitzit overrides the mitzvah of shatnez. The only problem is that there's no way to do the mitzvah without violating shatnez, because it has to be a wool string. The only problem is when it comes nighttime, you're not doing a mitzvah anymore. All you have is the shatnez on. Shechovat tzitzit bayom v'lo b'layla, because the mitzvah of tzitzit is at daytime, not nighttime. Shene'emar uritem oto, because it says you should see the tzitzit. B'shat re'iyah, the time when you can see it. In other words, during daytime is the only time that the mitzvah applies. V'somer chayav b'tzitzit says that a person who's blind is obligated in tzitzit. Why? Didn't you just tell me that it has to be able to see? So Stevie Wonder, he doesn't have to wear tzitzit. For other reasons too, but you can't see. The answer is that when it says that it has to be the time of re'iyah, it doesn't mean you as an individual have to see the tzitzit. You might not be able to see. But the fact is they have to be at a time when they are visible. Okay? There's a difference between you seeing and a thing being visible. So it has to be a time of visibility. Not necessarily that you individually will see the tzitzit, but they will be seen because it's daytime. That's the concept of tzitzit.
People knowing but night also, even sleeping in it.
Sure, no. Actually, yeah, the Shulchan Aruch mentions people sleeping in it, and in fact, there's a big machloket about what is the definition of kisut laila. Because according to the Rambam understands it the way the Shulchan Aruch understands it, which is that, or I should say the other way around. The Shulchan Aruch follows the Rambam's view that basically it's a day-night thing. It's when you're wearing it that defines it. So daytime there's a mitzvah, nighttime there isn't a mitzvah. But there's another shita of the Rosh that has a totally different understanding of what Kisut Laila, and I believe the Rabbeinu Tam also, different understanding of Kisut Laila, that it's whether the garment is designated for day or night. So in other words, your pajama talit that you if you have like a wrap that you wear at night in bed, that would always be patur, even if you wear it during the day. And something that you wear during the day would always be obligated in tzitzit, even if you wore it at night. So if you put on your talit at night, according to the Rosh, since it's made for daytime use, you would say the barakah. That's what he would say. So there were some people who even at night would wear the tzitzit because of that. Because there is an opinion that says that if these tzitzit were made for daytime use, then the mitzvah applies even at night. But the Rambam doesn't say that. The Rambam says it has to be during the daytime, and it has to be because it has to be at a time where there is visibility. Not that Mr. X can see it, just that it's visible, because it's supposed to be something that can be seen.
It's a big liable, because I don't take this off and put on pajamas. In the morning in Neitzachama, I don't right away take off my pajamas, put on my clothes.
Right. Well, that's true. They don't define. I don't think that they define. Yeah. No. You're right. They don't define kisut laila in that sense that something that you immediately take off at night is your kisut yom. What it means is the main thing that you wear during the day. You wouldn't go out in your pajamas during the day. It's true. You might not change into your pajamas until 10 o'clock at night, but still, that's clearly only for night. And your daytime clothes, you just happen to still have them on. But it's not that it's not your daytime clothes.
But at Neitzachama, I don't right away take off.
No, that's true. I don't think it's that exact. It's not going to be in terms of the timing as much as in terms of the usage. And the usage is that this is what you wear out during the day, and what you might wear, and you might have pajamas that you wear at night.
The Rif agrees with Rambam.
Rambam, of course. They only disagree in 12 places. All right, so mutar la'adam lilbosh tzitzit balayla. A person can wear tzitzit at night. Ben b'chol ben b'shabbat. He can wear it on the weekday, he can wear it on Shabbat, even though you might think, maybe it's carrying because it's unnecessary to wear it at night. No. Even though it's not the right time for tzitzit, ubilvad shelo yivarech. He just doesn't say a bracha. That's why when we put on the talit, let's say at Kal Nidre, we tell people, make sure to put on the talit before sunset, because once it's sunset, you can't say the bracha anymore. If you want to be able to get one less bracha in before Yom Kippur begins, you want to say it before the sun sets. What is the morning cutoff? In other words, when does the time begin that you're allowed to wear the tzitzit and say the blessing? When there's enough light outside that you can distinguish between the blue and the white in the talit. In other words, in the tzitziot. So when you can when there's enough sunlight, it doesn't mean now we have electric lights. You can say, well, I can always distinguish. I just flip on the light, I'll be able to see. It means when there's enough light outside that a person would be able to see, it would be able to distinguish between white and blue that's wrapped together. Which, if you've ever tried to pick matching clothes in a pitch black room because you can't turn on the light because your spouse is sleeping, you know that it's not that easy even to tell the difference between dark and light colors when it's pitch black. You might think it is, but it's really not. And then you come out with 2 different colored socks or something like that, and then it's certainly not that easy. So you need a certain amount of light to be able to tell even the difference between white and blue when they're wrapped together like that, when they're woven together. So and you can take a look at your luach, and if you have a handy luach, a luach is manim that tells you all the times. It will say for each day what's the time of Mishiyakir, what's the earliest time that you can put on a talit and so on. So now he says, "V'ketzad mivarech alea." What do you say as a blessing on this? Baruch Adai Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehitatef b'tzitzit. Both the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch only have one blessing on tzitzit. Lehitatef b'tzitzit. They don't have a blessing of al mitzvah tzitzit at all. Okay, only lehitatef b'tzitzit, which means to enwrap myself in tzitzit. Let's say you put on the talit multiple times in a day. Every time you put it on, you can say another beracha. You don't say a blessing when you make tzitzit. Making tzitzit is not the mitzvah, even though it says ve'asu lahem tzitzit. Right? So you might think that is the mitzvah, but actually it is the wearing of the tzitzit that constitutes the mitzvah. That is when the blessing is recited. This is similar to making Sukkot. It says, Chag HaSukkot ta'aseh. You're supposed to make Sukkot. But really the mitzvah is only when you actually dwell in the sukkah, that you're going to say the blessing. And you're allowed to go into the bathroom or the bathhouse wearing tzitziot. We know that. We go in the bathroom with tzitzit all the time. If you have tzitzit under your clothes, you don't have to get undressed every time you go in the bathroom. If you go to the mikveh and you go into the bathroom on the way in, you have tzitzit, people hang their tzitzit up, it's no problem. Not only that, if your talit gets cut, the tzitziot get cut, you throw it in the trash. People are always shocked when I tell them that you're allowed to throw tzitziot in the trash. They say, well, no, it's holy. Why? Nobody ever said that the tzitziot has kedusha. In fact, the Rambam said you don't even, according to the Rambam, which we don't follow this level of leniency. The Shulchan Aruch is more strict. According to the Rambam, when you make tzitziot, you don't even have to say l'shem mitzvah tzitzit, and you certainly don't have to say l'shem kedushat tzitzit because it doesn't have kedusha. It's just a mitzvah that you have to make it. But it's not something that has holiness to it.
Well, if a goy made it, it would be puzzle.
That's true, because it has to be done by somebody who's obligated, who's obligated in mitzvah. But and he says because it says daber el bnei Yisrael v'asulahem tzitzit. But it doesn't mean that he has to actually have kavanah when he's making it, that there's some holiness to the tzitziot. The Rambam says that there's only kedusha in something that has some connection to the name of Hashem. That's a general principle in the Rambam. So it has to be like a mezuzah, tefillin, sefer Torah. These have kedusha because the name of God is actually written on them in some way or another. But tzitziot doesn't have the name of God written in it.
This is getting to the Chitah with the 10-5.
That's another issue. Yeah, but even there's no letters. There's no letters. It's just numbers. So you see, this whole halakha revolves around the same principle. The Rambam is trying to prove to you that there's no kedusha in tzitzit. So he says, first of all, you can go in the bathroom with it. Second of all, you can throw it in the trash. And third of all, you're not allowed to sell tzitzit to a goy. You're not allowed to sell a talit with tzitzit to a goy. So you might think that that's because it has kedusha. Like you're not supposed to sell a mezuzah to a goy, you don't know what he's going to do with it. But that's not the reason. He says, Lo mipnei sheyesh begufa kedusha. Don't think it's because it has kedusha. It's not true. Ela shema yitatef ba. The problem is this goy is going to put on a talit. And then Jew is going to trust him. He's going to say, oh, look at this religious Jew. I can trust him. And he's going to think he's a Jew and he's going to kill him. Now obviously that's an exaggeration. We don't think that every non-Jew is going to kill you. But the idea is that a person who, if you give a talit with tzitziot to a non-Jew, he might pass for a Jew. And if he passes for a Jew, like these guys who go on the bus, we'll give him an aliyah. What's happened? Almost, or the guy will get in a bus, like these guys. They get in a bus wearing the talit and they blow it up, and everybody trusts them. Why do they trust him? Oh, because he looks like a religious guy. He's got tzitzit, and now you don't even need tzitzit. You shouldn't be able to sell black hats. Yeah, to a non-Jew because he's going to wear a black hat. Everyone's going to think he's Jewish. And then they let him in. They think he's a rabbi. Actually, not only do they think he's Jewish, they think he's a rabbi if he wears a black hat. And he has a beard. Forget it. We should make them all shave.
There's a French movie about this.
Yeah, it's really true. Now, okay, so let's do one last halakha on this page, and then Bezrat Hashem, when we come back, which will be in 2 weeks, we'll do these last two halachot of the Rambam, and then we'll get to the Shulchan Aruch. But I just want to do this last one because it's so interesting. He says, "Nashim va'avadim uktanim peturin min hatzitzit min haTorah." That biblically speaking, women, slaves, and children are exempt from tzitzit. Umidivrei chachamim shekol katan shodei lehitatef chayav b'tzitzit. However, any child who's capable of wrapping himself in tzitzit, rabbinically, mishum chinuch. Because it's training in mitzvot. We train children to start observing mitzvot from a young age. V'nashim va'avadim sheratzu letatef b'tzitzit. Here's where you see that Sephardim, they're normal. They're not. We don't get all bent out of shape about these things. If a woman or a slave, not that we have slaves, thank God today, but were we to have them, wanted to wear tzitzit. Mitatfim below bracha, so they put on the talit without a bracha. It doesn't say anywhere that a woman is not allowed to wear a talit. Similarly, with all other mitzvot that women are exempt, if any woman wants to do a mitzvah that she's not obligated in, we don't protest, we don't object, we don't arrest them, we don't drag them off to the Israeli jails from the kotel. That's the Rambam says. If you have a person whose gender is uncertain, okay, for biological reasons, androgynos, right, or he's right. So tumtum is uncertain. Androgynos is he's both. So in both cases, we can't really tell what they are because we don't know how to exactly categorize one who's both. And the tumtum is somebody who has no clearly identifiable genitalia, so we have no clue. So chayavin b'chulam misafek lefichach in mevarchin osin b'lo bracha. So since we don't know if he's a man or a woman, so we say do the mitzvah, but without a blessing because you might not be obligated. But it's a very important principle here that is forgotten, which is that for a woman to do a mitzvah that she's not obligated in is no problem. The only thing is we say don't say a blessing. Why don't you say a blessing? Because you don't want somebody to say asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, that the woman can't say, God, you commanded me to do this action, because she wasn't commanded to do it. But Hashem didn't say prevent a woman from doing a mitzvah that she's not obligated in. Now, the custom today, the prevalent custom is that women generally don't wear a talit, they don't wear tefillin, but the Rambam's view is en mimachin biyadan. We don't protest against women who want to do it. We just we tell them don't say a bracha so that they're not taking Hashem's name in vain, and that's our only responsibility. So certainly, if he were to see what they do with the women that they arrest every other week, at the hotel, he would probably say, "Listen, they might not be. I might not think that what they're doing is necessary or that, but to arrest them, it's not necessary because in mimachin biyadan, if they want to put on a talit, it's no big problem." Okay, have a good day.